Hello, this is Jamey with Stonemaier Games, and this week I'm going to talk about skill tests and skill checks in a variety of tabletop games. This is a topic that's been on my mind a lot lately because I'm working on a game that requires a skill test to happen quite frequently throughout the game, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to do it. And so I thought I'd evaluate the way a bunch of other games do it, and share my thoughts on these mechanisms in these other games. So it's a little hard to define a skill test or a skill check, and you'll see why in a second. I'll try to do this very briefly, then jump into the list. But what I've come up with is that a skill check is a threshold set by the game itself that you, the player, or the players are trying to reach or exceed. And the classic example of this is Dungeons and Dragons, which I'll mention in a second. But I just want to be clear that it's not the same as a cost, even though sometimes in skill checks or skill tests, you do spend something or you have the choice of spending something. But it's different than like going to a market and just buying something where you're exchanging coins for the item that you're receiving. Even though that comes strikingly close to resembling what a skill check or a skill test is. And part of that is related to the skills that usually a character in the game, sometimes a greater entity, sometimes even the player itself, has skill levels that define your ability to approach different skill tests. So I might have a strength level built into my character of 4, and so I know that I am better than a character who only has a strength of 2 at accomplishing a strength test. Yeah, I think that's as far as I'll go into the definition, but I might return to it during this video. But as I mentioned, Dungeons and Dragons is kind of the classic skill test here, where you are given a threshold that you need to receive. Like you might say, okay, the threshold to beat this monster is 16, and you get to roll a d20. And when you roll that d20, you need to either roll a 16 or higher, and you get to modify that with your skill. So you might have a, if you're doing a range test, your archery skill might be a d20 plus 5. And so you might roll that d20 and you might only get 14, but then you get to add 5 to it, and that gets you over that 16 threshold set by that specific monster, that specific archery challenge. A range challenge. So that's kind of the classic method, and I think that in terms of simplicity, it can work quite well. It can help steer you in terms of what you're good at, as skill tests often do. You might, in that instance, you might decide, okay, I might choose archery to fight this monster instead of hand-to-hand combat, which I'm not good at. I think there are also downsides to it, and I guess I'll go into the other examples, and I'll approach the downsides as I give these other examples. Let's do Eldritch Horror and Mansions of Madness next. In these games, this is almost a more classic version of the skill test. You do have a built-in skill level ability, or a number, and then you have to roll a few dice. And if you get a 5 or a 6 on those dice, that just counts as a point towards the success or not of what you're trying to accomplish. And there are actually, as I'm saying that, there are some games that even just look for, I think this is Mansions of Madness, it just looks for a certain number of successes. And actually, no, this is what it is. The skill number, I'm sorry, I miswrote this here. You're not doing any math here, really. Rather, with Eldritch Horror and Mansions of Madness, your skill is the number of dice you get to roll, and the skill test itself is giving you a number of successes that you need to achieve. So it might say, okay, you need 2 successes, and your skill might be 4. That means you get to roll 4 dice, and if at least 2 of those dice come up with a 5 or a 6, then you pass the mission. You pass the skill test. I think this has merit because it takes math out of the equation. You're not actually adding up any numbers, really. You're just rolling dice equal to your skill number. And I think that works pretty well. I think that the downside of this is that you can just simply fail. And oftentimes the odds are even in the favor of failing. And so it leads to good moments when you succeed against the odds. But it can lead to wasted turns. And that's actually like an overarching topic here why I'm thinking about this. I don't want players to have to waste turns on skill checks, but I still want the stakes to be pretty high. And so in terms of simplicity, I do like the Eldritch Horror and Mansions of Madness method. But in terms of the potential of a wasted turn, I'm not as big of a fan of this as some of the other methods. One method that I'm a huge fan of is the near and far method. And I'm glad I'm mentioning this. There are several other games like this in this list, because skill checks maybe are often associated with cooperative games, but there are plenty of competitive games that actually do use skill tests and skill checks. So near and far, you're moving around this map and you encounter threats along the way. And the threats have a number associated with them that gets harder throughout the game. So early in the game, a threat might be 4. It might be a group of thieves, and their threat level is 4. And what you need to do is roll a die and add that number to the number of swords that you have. There's some other skill checks as well, but swords are one of the types of skill checks in near and far with these threats. So you roll a die, you add that number. So say I roll a 2 and say I have 2 swords. And if that total is 4, if that is equal to or exceeds the threat level, then I defeat the threat. However, and this is what I really like about near and far, at that point, if you haven't reached the threshold of the skill test, you can spend hearts to reach that level. And I love the push and pull here, because you don't want to have to spend hearts. So there is that level of uncertainty. There's that dramatic moment that you get from a game like Eldritch Horror of rolling the dice and seeing what you get with that die. But if you don't roll as well as you hoped, you don't lose your turn, really. You don't just have an empty turn where you didn't do anything, because you can spend hearts to get over that threshold. Hearts in the game mean several different things, but they are important. They are good to have. You need to have hearts. So I really like this element of having a little bit of randomness, but you can mitigate that with spending something that you don't really want to spend, but you can if you want to. That's near and far. I'm sorry I don't have a ton of visual examples today, but I do have a few that I'll get to in a minute. Call to Adventure is one that I just recently played, and I spoke very highly of the skill test in this game, because instead of rolling dice, you have these two-sided runes that you're just throwing down on the table. And there are a couple different elements that go into making me really like this skill test, even though it does have the possibility of you just simply failing. Part of it is the amount of choice that you have going into it. So you're choosing the skill test out of a wide range of tests that are on the table. So that's part of it. You have plenty of choices instead of just being told, okay, this is what you're doing. Plenty of choices. You always get 3 standard runes, so you still always have the potential of getting 3 successes. And in Call to Adventure, you're trying to reach a certain number threshold with these runes that you're throwing down. You always have, or you often have, some special runes that you also get to throw down that aren't necessarily successes, but they might even be a huge success, 3 instead of just 1, or there might be some other little bonuses. And you have the option of taking dark runes, which I think the dark runes actually guarantee the successes, but if you use the dark runes, you have the possibility of your character itself becoming darker and more evil. So I like that choice is in there. All this input choice that goes into it. On the opposite end, if you fail a skill test in Call to Adventure, you remove the card from the table. So it might be a card that you're worried about another player taking, and so you could kind of use the skill test as a way of getting that card off the table. Also, you gain an experience point that you can use for other things throughout the game. It's not a victory point. Well, at the end of the game, it is a victory point, but during the game, you can use these XP tokens for various purposes. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Almost a little too much to remember every time you do a skill test, but it's right on the border there. But I do like the variety of input options, the agency that you have going into a skill test in Call to Adventure. Arkham Horror LCG is another Fantasy Flight example. I think a lot of Fantasy Flight games are on this list because they seem to gravitate towards this style of game. In Arkham Horror LCG, you have a set skill number. You also have cards that modify it, and you have this bag building element where so say the skill number is 5 and you have 5 skill for it. You still have to draw a token out of the bag that modifies your number. Actually, I'm not even, it's been a while since I played. I'm not sure if it modifies your number or if it modifies the skill test number, if it makes that more difficult or less difficult. Either way, it's pretty much the same thing. But I find it interesting that they're using this bag mechanism here instead of dice. So you have some information about what's in the bag, and you've possibly helped build that bag. It's a shared bag between all the different players. So you have some sort of information there, but you still don't know exactly what you're drawing out of the bag. And so you might make a choice going into the challenge of, even though you have that 5 skill, you might still contribute like a revolver or some card, some special card, some one-time use card to the challenge, to the skill test, to increase your odds or to kind of mitigate the risk of whatever token it is that you're going to draw out of the bag. So again, similar to Eldritch Horror and Mansions of Madness, like there is the possibility of you just having a wasted turn because of the output randomness that's coming out of the bag or the dice roll. But it still is interesting that you have a bag of tokens instead of dice in Arkham Horror LCG. Battlestar Galactica is one of the most interesting skill tests on this list because it is a truly cooperative skill test with the possibility of a traitor impacting the test itself. It's been a while since I played this, so I might be a little foggy on the exact details. But the idea is that you have a certain number threshold associated, I think, with a color typically. So a skill test might be, okay, 4 green and 2 red. And those correspond to skill cards that you have in your hand, and players secretly put them all face down. So like collectively, you might have the skill challenge, the skill test. So it's not one player has the skill challenge, all the players have the skill test. And all players have the choice of contributing their cards face down towards the skill test. And then you reveal all the cards and see, okay, did we meet the test or did we not? And because there's the traitor element here, there's a huge element of uncertainty because you can talk equally. You can talk completely openly while this is happening and say, okay, guys, I'm going to put in, actually, I think this is in the rules. I think you can say, okay, I'm putting in 3 green, and you can know that you're calculating it perfectly based on that information. But because of the traitor element or the possibility of a traitor, you never really know what the other players are going to put into that pile. Dead of Winter also does something similar to this. So I really like this element of using cards as the skill test, these cards that you're collecting throughout the game, and having the uncertainty of the skill test come from the other players themselves instead of a die roll by you or a random number generated by the game itself. Legacy of Dragonholt and Graphic Novel Adventures. Actually, this is one of the games I do have. Legacy of Dragonholt. Here we go. So this uses a diceless method and kind of a randomness, a lack of randomness method as well. Because in Legacy of Dragonholt, you're given options, basically. You encounter a band of soldiers and you have the option of negotiating with them or fighting them or running away from them. But each of those options are enabled by a keyword, a skill keyword that your character either has or doesn't have, or someone in the group of characters has or doesn't have that keyword. And so the entire skill test here is, do you have the skill keyword or not? Do you have that? Do you have that trait or not? I think they're called either traits or characteristics or keywords, something like that. But they're words that you either have or you do not have. So it's an all or nothing proposition, but you know that going into the challenge, and there's always one option that says, like, if you don't have any of these skill keywords, this is what you do. This is what you have to do. So I like that design, especially in a story-driven game. I like that there are choices, but they're determined by who your characters inherently are. You either do have archery or you don't. There's no middle ground there. That's Legacy of Dragonholt and Graphic Novel Adventures. So this is a category that I was really hesitant to get into because you can look at any board game and say, okay, this is the moment of skill in this game. This is where skill matters. But I wanted to have one example of a skill test where actual player skill, like your actual abilities, matter in the game. And the example I wanted to give there is Flipships. Flipships is a dexterity cooperative game. And there's many moments of skill throughout the game, but the skill test itself that I consider like the big one is the mothership, which is essentially a box that you're building on the game table itself that you are at some point in the game trying to flick tokens into. It's a flicking game. You're trying to flick tokens all during the game, but you need to get a certain number of hits on the mothership itself to defeat the game. And so it's kind of an ongoing skill test related to your actual ability of flicking tiles into the mothership box. That I consider it a skill test. I think it's kind of an ongoing skill test that requires your actual abilities to achieve it. That's Flipships. Actually, I have all my examples here in a row, my visual examples. Seventh Continent is the last example of a game that I actually own here. In Seventh Continent, the skill tests use a deck of cards in a really interesting way. So there's a shared deck of cards among all the players, and there are stars on some of those cards. There are not stars on other cards. Sometimes there are half stars on those cards. And you decide going into a skill test, and skill tests they require different numbers of stars. You decide going into the test how many cards you're going to draw. So you say you know that you need 4 stars to accomplish the skill test. You kind of talk as a group and say, okay, how many cards do we want to draw here? Because you don't decide that as you're drawing. You say going into it, okay, let's draw 5 cards and hope that we get it. And the reason that you even discuss this is because the deck of cards is your life in the game. So you don't want to draw more cards than you have to. So I really like this element. I like how it leads to a little bit of discussion. And you also look at modifiers as you're doing this. The different characters have different modifiers. And so I really like the way this works out. And there's compensation. If you fail, you still get... I don't think you get all of the cards, but you get some of those cards that you draw. They have other purposes that you can then use and keep. You at least have the option of keeping some of those cards. So I like that. So even though it can lead to kind of a dead turn, there's always a benefit that you're getting from drawing these cards. And I like that players are fully... They have the choice. They decide how many cards that they're drawing going into a challenge, a skill test in Seventh Continent. Time Stories and Reckoners. These are examples of skill tests where you're presented with a threshold of either... actually, Time Stories I do have. I should have brought that out. I have it on the floor back there. In Time Stories and Reckoners, you have this threshold that you're trying to reach to like defeat an enemy, say. But you can chip away at it. So a lot of these skill tests that I've mentioned are all or nothing. You have one chance to accomplish it, and if you don't, then you fail. You fail the skill test, and you have to go back and try again if you want to. In Time Stories and Reckoners, you are incentivized to accomplish the skill test on the first try, and usually that means that you're rolling a certain number of dice. At least in Time Stories you are. In Reckoners, you're spending dice to chip away at the bad guy's life. But in Time Stories, you're rolling a certain number of dice, kind of like in Eldritch Horror. If your skill level is 3, you're rolling 3 dice. But you get to chip away at it. However, you're incentivized to do it right away, to accomplish the skill test as soon as possible, because if you don't, in the Reckoners, the hero can many of the heroes can recover, or they can deal damage as a result of still being around, or whatever they do. They often have different variety of bad things that they can do. In Time Stories, there's a more simplified element where oftentimes they're just going to deal damage to you if you haven't taken care of the enemy all in one fell swoop. So there are reasons to kind of collaborate with other players and take care of these guys one by one, the bad guys. But there's also it's also nice that you can feel progress in chipping away at the life of the bad guys, or whatever the skill challenge is in Time Stories and Reckoners. That way it's not an all or nothing proposition. House of Danger is one that I have not played, but I had friends play it adjacent to me yesterday, and they talked me through the skill test, and I thought it was worth mentioning. Because in House of Danger, again, you're rolling a die, you're trying to reach a certain threshold. But the twist here is that you get, for many of the skill tests, you get unlimited re-rolls. So you can keep rolling that die over and over again. However, every time you roll the die, every time you re-roll the die, your psychic ability, which is, I think, one of the core abilities in the game, your level of psychic ability, kind of a resource that you have to spend, goes down. So you're essentially spending something to continually reroll as much as you want, and you have to kind of decide at some point, do we just stop rerolling? Is it too hard, or do we keep going? and chipping away at our psychic ability. So it's a little bit like the near and far thing, where you're spending hearts after you would fail the skill test. You're spending hearts, and this you're spending a resource in the game, but you're still having the chance of failing. So I don't actually know if I like that. I think I like the near and far method better. If you are going to spend something, I like that you're adding certainty to it. But I appreciate what they're doing in House of Danger of adding just more rerolls throughout the game, throughout each skill test. My last example before I get to my game are two games, Treasure Mountain and Kingsburg. And the twist with each of these, again, Treasure Mountain's the newest one that I played most recently, where you roll a die, like when the dragon's about to attack in Treasure Mountain, you roll a die to determine the group's strength to fight the dragon. It's a competitive game, but everyone shares that one die, at least in the Rado variant, apparently, of this game. So say you roll the die, you come up with a 3. And then each player gets to bid like axe tokens. I think they're axe tokens. And you reveal them, and you're trying to be the player with the most axe tokens revealed, and you get a special benefit if you do. But at the very least, you're trying to use those axe tokens to defeat the dragon. You're hoping that someone defeats the dragon. The twist here, though, and so this is similar to Kingsburg, is that unless you looked, you don't know the power of the dragon you're trying to defeat. So when you roll like the die and it comes up with a 4, the dragon's level might be a 4 for all you know. You don't really know. You have to have taken an action during that round or during a previous round to see what the number is of the upcoming dragon. So this is really interesting because there is a level of variability with the die going into it. But if you know the number of the dragon, there's also a certain level of certainty as to how many tokens that you need to spend to defeat the dragon. But that knowledge is your choice. If you had to decide during the round to actually go and look at that dragon or not. So I like that there is a little bit of kind of output uncertainty here with the dragon in Treasure Mountain and the evil hordes in Kingsburg. That brings us, so that's all the games I'm going to mention. I think that's 12 different examples of different types of skill tests in games. I am sure I've missed some. I'm sure your definition might vary slightly from mine, and I'd love to hear your examples in the comments of skill tests, skill challenges, skill checks that you enjoy in tabletop games. At the end here, I wanted to discuss my game a little bit. I'm not going to go into specifics of what the game is, but the struggle that I'm having with it, I just wanted to talk about this for a little bit, is that that balance. Like, I don't want players to have wasted turns, but I also want players to have the feeling of succeeding against the odds. I think that feels good. I'd like there to be some variation, but also some uncertainty. And so I'm really struggling with like where exactly to add in the variation and uncertainty in these skill tests. An example of a skill test in this game would be you encounter a creature and you're given a few options of how you want to deal with that creature. Do you try to talk to that creature? Do you try to fight that creature, or maybe you try to steal from that creature? So a few different options. With each of those options varying in difficulty based on who that creature is. So I have that part pretty certain. Like I'm pretty sure that that's how I want it to work, at least in terms of what you know going into the skill test. The part that I'm unsure about is the other side, like what the player is actually doing to decide whether or not they accomplish that skill test. One of the methods that I've had for a while now has just been that you spend cards to either meet or not meet that skill test, but those cards are renewable, so they go back to your hand, which is fine, but that system kind of leads to certainty every time that you do it. Like, you're probably going to only choose the options that you can definitely succeed. And one really important thing in this game is that I want players to choose the option that feels the best to them. I don't want them to just always go for the option that they can definitely succeed with. So if there's if the talking to the creature example, if that's only takes 2 skill, fighting the creature, say that takes 4 skill, and say stealing from the creature takes 6 skill. So different levels of skill. I don't want players to just choose the 2 because that's the only one they can accomplish. And so that's why I want there to be some level of variation, some level of uncertainty to let players choose the option that they really want, but not always necessarily succeed. And I keep going back to near and far because I really do like that near and far method of having that you can essentially always succeed in a test in near and far, but you might need to spend extra resources, whatever that is. In near and far, it's the hearts. You might need to spend that on the back end to make that success happen. And you may not always want to do that. There might even be times. So basically the thing here in near and far is if you are going to have a dead turn, it's going to be your choice. It's not the game telling you that you have a dead turn. It's your choice to do that. Of course, this is also tied to like the action selection mechanism in my game, which is still a little uncertain, so I won't go into that here. But overall, I'm just kind of looking at all of these different skill tests to see what's the most fun, what makes the stakes feel high, what gives players those moments of achieving something against the odds, but also not giving players complete certainty going into these skill tests so that it doesn't feel... I want it to feel a little bit more lifelike. Like the example that I always think of when I think about these skill tests is Archery. And the example I gave earlier in the video in regards to Dungeons and Dragons. With Archery, if you have a really good archer, they're going to hit the bullseye 19 times out of 20, maybe even more than that. I don't even know the exact odds, but they're going to hit it a ton of times. So if you have someone who has that archery skill and they are very good at it, they've honed that skill, there's almost no uncertainty at all that they are going to fail. But there's a little bit, like just a tiny little bit. And so I want skill tests to reflect that level of uncertainty. And in my game, it might need to even change a little bit because, like with the example of talking to the creature, and getting to know them. There's uncertainty if you have a different language and you're trying to communicate with that other creature, there's uncertainty that you'll be able to actually communicate that what you're trying to communicate and actually speak to them. But if you have a linguistic skill, then you might be better at doing that. You might be better at communicating with someone in a foreign language. There's also the uncertainty though of what that other creature wants, like how they want to engage with you. So you don't really know that. I'm trying to decide like how much should the game tell you that information versus you experiencing it in more of a random variable way. And there's also actually tied to that as well. Like if you do fail and you encounter that creature again at a certain point in the game, should that skill test be exactly the same for that creature, or should it be different every time you encounter that creature? Like with the fighting example, if you choose to fight that creature, yes, in any battle, any hand-to-hand combat, there is uncertainty. There are variables that happen. But if I fight that creature now, and then I opposed to fighting them later, should their strength be all that variable, or should it be pretty much the same? Like they're the same creature, I'm fighting them. Should their strength remain the same at different points in the game? So I'm trying to decide there, should that number always be static? Should that creature always have strength of 4? Or should it be variable? Should their strength vary a little bit? Or should the battle itself, is that where the randomness arrives? So it's not really my skill or your skill, but it's just the act of the battle is where the variation can happen. So many different factors to think about. Going into this video, I was kind of amazed at how many different types of skill test designers have implemented with varying degrees of success, I think. But it was a fun topic for me to explore. I hope you had fun watching this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on skill tests and challenges and skill checks in games that you enjoy. And I know I've been pretty vague about my game, but if you want to talk about that, I'm happy to discuss that as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, thanks for joining me for this week's Sunday Sit Down. I'll be back on Tuesday with a game mechanism video. Take care.